Thanks for tuning in to My Valley, His Victory, hosted by me, Mackenzie Smith, where I interview Christians who love the outdoors and have walked through valleys in their lives. In a world of highlight reels and surface-level relationships, we all have faced hardships. I believe our experiences can be encouraging to others if we have the courage to be vulnerable. 2 Corinthians 1 says, "The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." My goal is to inspire you to come to the Creator through His creation and connect you with Christians who have been through similar experiences. I pray that this podcast encourages you if you are in a valley and pushes you to share how God has turned your past valley into His victory. On today's episode of My Valley, His Victory, we have David Farmer, originally from Ohio, but now lives in Washington. He is working as a tax accountant. He also enjoys hiking, cooking, and most recently, golf. He also has a passion for sharing the love of Christ. Thanks so much for being with us today, David.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I gave the listeners a little short intro about you, but why don't you tell us just a little bit more about yourself and who you are?
Yeah, so I grew up in Ohio. Grew up kind of in the middle between farmland and the city. So I spent a lot of time outdoors, but I didn't develop so far away from society that I got stuck. So a few years ago, I moved out to Washington just to get away and really started to develop more outdoorsy hobbies once I moved. And now I do quite a bit of hiking, quite a bit of, just general outdoor stuff. Live right on the coast, so go up to the beach a lot. And then in terms of my faith, I grew up in the church, and I think my journey is maybe a little different. I had a very Pentecostal upbringing, and then that moved later on to more Reformed views. But I'm really a blend of a lot of different sects, which I think is really good. And you see Christ through different lenses in each church. And
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And what kind of took you, why Washington? Out of all the places to move, why Washington?
Well, it was going to be Portland, Maine, but I had a friend that lived in Washington. So in the town I live in, Bellingham, I just on a whim posted to Craigslist to see if anyone had a room. And there was someone that messaged me like right away that had something in my budget and right where I wanted to live. So I just jumped on it and went with it and haven't looked back.
Wow. So you literally moved there, no job, knowing nobody, nothing.
Nothing. Yeah, the guy who I moved that did live here, he was living in Colorado at the time. So big jump, big leap of faith. But the Lord has had it work out better than I could have imagined.
Yeah. Wow. So tell us a little bit about Bellingham, Washington, and what there is to do there and what you like about it, or maybe what you don't like about it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so Bellingham is about an hour and a half north of Seattle. It is about an hour south of Vancouver, Canada. So it's in this like weird in between. On the east, there's a mountain, and on the west, there's the coast. So there are people, they'll ski a ton in the winter, and then they'll do a lot of boating in the summer. So it's a really unique place where you can do a lot of outdoors things, and it's in the mountains pretty much. So it's really beautiful to just go hike somewhere. And then because it's so close to the coast, most of the hikes have an overlook of the ocean, which is really cool. Yeah. So it's like 5 biomes in one little area. So I love that about it.
Yeah. It seems like it's like maybe a really good spot if someone really loves the beach and the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of people who are, one or the other, but I don't know. The coast of Oregon is amazing, which, is kind of mountainy and beachy. I would think that's what a lot of Bellingham is like. I have pretty sure I've driven through there, but I have not stopped and hung out and did, all the things. Spent a lot of time in Seattle, but not Bellingham. So I'll have to come check it out. And so you said you like to hike. Is Washington kind of where you learned to love to hike, or did you get started in that sometime when you were in Ohio, or kind of how did your passion for that start being a Midwest guy?
Yeah, so the hiking, my dad was really outdoorsy growing up, so he would take me outside, and I was in 5th grade. We took a trip to a place called Glen Helen. It's a little nature reserve near where I live, and I remember really liking that. But most of the hikes where I grew up were relatively short, but there was some outdoorsy stuff where I grew up. So there's a river, it's Stillwater River, and you could walk along that for a couple miles in some places. And then when I moved out here, I was really hesitant because there were no hills where I grew up, and there are a lot of hills where I live now. So it took me a little bit to get my endurance up and to be able to hike that. But then once I started hiking and going to overlooks and doing these really big long hikes, 10 miles plus, then I was really into it. So it started a little bit when I was young, but once I moved out here, I'll do anything for a view.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm like, I'll go as far as I need to. You just lead the way and I'll be there.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you live in a really beautiful place and, get to see some really awesome terrain. Would love to kind of hear how being surrounded by that plays a role in your relationship with Christ, or kind of being in the outdoors plays a role in your relationship with Christ.
Yeah. One of the things that there's so many trails around here that it's not hard to find a really good trail where a lot of people are not hiking. So there's one I'll go up to specifically. I try to go once every weekend or every other weekend, and I go up and I just pray, and I'll go up to the overlook and back down, and it gives me like a solid 2 to 3 hours just being in God's creation and talking to him. And then another thing, when I moved out here, I'd never seen a mountain before, so I kept calling all the hills mountains. And then I finally saw a mountain, and it's just so unfathomably big, and it's such a great analogy for God, which I think is why it's used a lot in Scripture. And so to see that, just that awe of that mountain that just brings me so close to God so quickly. So that a lot of it is just solitude in the mountains is just so much easier for me to connect with God. And, there's no distractions like there are at home where I've, a TV and a gaming system, all that.
Yeah. In the mountains in Washington, you talked about how kind of grand they are. They look so grand also because you're going from sea level to these, huge peaks, where I feel like in most other states, the base of the mountains are at, 4,000 feet, let's say.
Yeah.
And so they're just so much grander because you're literally going from sea level to just these 10,000 foot peaks, which is just insane.
Mm-hmm.
And so I truly agree with you in that. It's kind of a good analogy for God and how grand he is, even though, nothing can compare. But, if we can see something, that definitely gives us that sense of awe and a little bit of understanding, Mm-hmm. But no, I love that you said that about the distractions. I find that so true. And just one of the only places I feel like we can really get that quiet solitude, undistractedness anymore in this world. And we talk about that a lot on this podcast, but man, it's just so true. We live in such a fast-paced world and full of so many distractions. So it's always good to get out there. So do you have a story that you can share with us about a way in which God has revealed himself to you, maybe through the outdoors, or a moment that just really sticks out to you?
Yeah. There was a time I was going through a rough patch, and this was when I was young. This was in Ohio, so that I was probably 18, 19 around then. And there was a trail near my house. It was a mile of actual trail and then a bunch of brush, but it was only probably a tenth of a mile of brush. And if you got through the brush, it opened up to the woods, and there was no trail, but it was clean enough you could walk through. And I remember I was just not having a good time with life, and some stuff had happened that was really, really had hurt me. And I remember walking on this trail, and I went a mile, and it was like, this is the first time I ever went through that brush. I was like, I'm just going to walk until I can't walk anymore, because I really just don't want to go back to living. And I walked probably 3-4 miles, and this was along the river, and it got to the point where it started to get a little sketchy. It was like a slope and then the river, and I remember sitting down, and it was just this picturesque day, and the river was flowing towards me, and it was very, very beautiful. And I remember sitting there and just asking God, why is this happening? And this peace just came over me, and it was like the Lord was saying, this is temporary. You'll be okay. One day I'll be with him, and everything will be like, that beauty will be like so small compared to the beauty of being with him forever. And that impacted me a lot. I think that really helped me just to keep living at that time. And for a while I would think back on that time and just remember that God does care for me and does love me.
Yeah. I love that he showed up and gave you peace in that moment, because so often we need that. And we're kind of looking for God and, asking him for things. And whenever he comes through and shows us that peace, whenever we're dealing with something like that, it's just beautiful and gives us, like you said, that encouragement to keep going. And I think it's even more beautiful that you had that kind of eternal mindset thought, because I know a lot of times that can be hard, and it can be hard to be like stuck in our situation here.
Mm-hmm.
But, if we are a true follower of Christ, like we know that this isn't it for us, right? And so it's like, even though things may be hard here, we have that promise of forever with him, and a place with no worries and no stress and no grief or anxiety or whatever it is that you were dealing with, at that time. And so I love that you had that thought. I know I get stuck there sometimes. I'm like, but this, this is what's going on, and this is our world. And I have to make that switch so often, or mindfully make that switch,
Yeah.
So obviously you live in a beautiful outdoors area in Washington, but for someone who lives maybe in the Midwest or in a place that doesn't have these grand mountains, what are some ways that they could connect with God through the outdoors without being in these grand places?
Yeah, I mean, the Midwest, it's really interesting because a lot of it, all you have to do is drive an hour in a direction, and you're going to find some woods. So I know up in Minnesota, it's especially the case. Iowa, you probably won't find woods. You probably find corn. But I grew up walking through cornfields, and there's still solitude. They're just not. Don't go in the cornfields when they're harvesting. You don't want to be in the feed. Yeah, it's definitely not as beautiful, but I think there's still that same awe that can be affected just by being with God. Like if I think looking at detail is a big thing. I remember walking through cornfields, and you get these tiny scrapes on you, and you look at the plant, and it's got these tiny, tiny little thorns on the leaves that'll scratch you up. And then you think about it more, and you think about how complicated these plants are, and there's just it goes deeper. So it's not as awe-inspiring on the outset, but if you really dig in and focus on it. So definitely had friends that would go and pick plants, and they were very big botanists around where I lived. And
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. You just have to pay attention to the detail and the little things around you. I've had a pretty good picture of that actually this week. So my mom has been in town, and obviously I live in Utah, and there's these huge mountains around, and what I think are just these awesome views. But then we go on a walk, and she's like picking up, looking at this plant and looking at this plant and looking at this little thing on the ground. And I'm like, how can you possibly be looking at that with all these other views around you? But, it's like sometimes it's the little things. It doesn't have to be these big, awesome things around you.
Yeah. I had a friend that he used to live a little bit south of where I live. And he said there's this big waterfall that he and his family went to. And he saw some people from the Midwest, and they were all taking pictures of these banana slugs because we don't have them out there. And they thought it was the greatest thing. They're just completely ignoring the waterfall. So I agree that the little things can be pretty big. And where I grew up, there's fireflies. I completely ignore them, but any visitors come, and it's like the greatest thing because it's a bug that lights up.
Yes, I love fireflies. That's such a Midwest thing, and love those things. You just squeeze them, and the stuff comes out, and it still lights up on your fingers.
Yep, that's the Midwest thing.
Probably shouldn't say that on a nature podcast. Someone's going to come at me, but it's fine. So,
yeah, well, my older sister.
I don't do that anymore, but when I was a kid, you put it on your face and it glows.
Yep.
I didn't know what I know back then. Okay, I was a kid.
Hey, I did the same thing. It was probably worse what we did. We would put them in this little jar and put like 50 of them, and then crush them up and try to use the night light. And it lasts for 10 minutes. This feels so bad now.
Yeah, we did some weird things as kids, but they are still populated on the planet today, so we did not make them go extinct.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
All right, so switching gears a little bit into the title of this podcast, My Valley, His Victory, would love for you to share with us a season of wilderness or a valley that you went through and what God taught you or maybe prepared you for in that season.
Yeah. So there's a season, this started, so this would have been March of 2020. And I have had a history of mental health issues, and they kind of crop up and dissipate. And I was just going through a really rough patch of that. And I remember sitting on the couch thinking, I got to do something. So I went on this 2-3 mile run, and I came back home, and I was still not feeling great. So I went out and ran another mile and came back, and I said something mean to my roommate, and a couple hours later he talked to me about it. And that was really the start of this whole season. And I realized that I had to change something in my life. And so I ended up starting to work out more and just trying to figure out how I could fix this. And I ended up listening to a guy. He's athletic guy, and he's done a lot of physical training, and he suffered a lot in his past. And so I kind of emulated him for a good 3 months, and somehow that just worked. Like I can't describe the transformation that took place over those 3 months, but I basically worked out 3-4 hours a day, and I built my confidence up, and I'd really never felt better. And I decided during that time that I would go and pursue my dreams of comedy. I was going to go move down to Texas. And as I was getting all set up for that, my sister passed away, and that just threw a wrench in everything. So all my mental health stuff cropped back up right away. I still moved down to Texas, but it was just not, all the reasons I wanted to move to Texas just didn't work out. So I was doing comedy, but I figured out pretty quickly it was not going to be a long-term thing for me. So I packed up and I moved back up to Washington. And that time was really hard. I spent about 5 months in Texas of just, crying myself to sleep half the time, not being around anybody. I didn't know anyone out there. For the first month there, I did a lot of comedy, and I just wasn't connecting with any of the guys that did comedy. I couldn't find a good church. So it's got to be a very, very lonely time. And during that time, I just prayed a lot and just questioned God. I mean, I never really was mad at God. I just didn't understand what was happening to me. And if just that whole season, that first part of the season, everything that could go wrong was going wrong. So after those 5 months were up, I ended up moving back up to Bellingham. And pretty quickly after that, I got lined up with a job. I started dating someone. We got reconnected with my church. And so I had this great friend group, and things started to look up. And this girl I was dating, after a few months, she started to have some mental health issues, and they were bad enough to where they kind of destroyed the relationship. And so that was very frustrating. And I spent probably a couple of weeks just out of it and not wanting to do much of anything. And then a month after that, I started just not being able to wake up and get out of bed. I was just completely exhausted, and I knew it wasn't as much of a mental thing because that never really has been a symptom of mine. So I went to the doctor, and they didn't find anything, but at the same time I was having heart palpitations, extreme fatigue, and I have a history of a heart problem, and I thought that was beginning to have a big effect, and the doctor said that probably wasn't the case. So I was just completely lost on what to do. I ended up having to quit my job because I couldn't function enough to be able to work it. So that just brought me to a really, really low place. And it felt like months. I mean, it was months, but it felt longer, where I was just laying in bed, not being able to do much. I spend probably 8 hours a day getting chores done around the house, reading a book, and then fall back asleep. And it just felt like there was no hope, that was it for me, and at this time I'm 25. I'm supposed to have a whole life ahead of me, and there's not a light at the end of the tunnel. After probably 2 months of that, a friend of mine started calling me because he figured out I was not doing well, and he started to ask me if I needed help, if he could do anything. And that was a really big deal for me. It felt like no one really cared. And when he was calling, then I started to understand, okay, people do care. I had another friend, on the days where I felt better, we'd go out, and he was filming little videos at the college campus near us, so I'd go and film him. And those were some good days. But overall, it was just a rough time. I ended up needing to move because I couldn't afford rent there anymore. And that same friend that had been calling me and checking on me, he helped me move. And it was at that point he really started to dig in, like, this guy needs help, because I was talking to him while I was moving, and he figured out pretty quick I was not in a good spot. So every week he would come by and we just talk for an hour or two. And I was doing research because I was getting really sick of being sick. And I looked at iron deficiency, and I really didn't think it was a thing at first, but I figured I would just try it. So I got some dark chocolate and I ate a bunch of it, and I started to feel better pretty immediately, which was very surprising for me. So then I went and got an iron supplement, and I started taking that. And over the span of 3 months, I got a lot better. During that 3 months, I ended up moving out of that place because that had black mold, and my friend that kept visiting me was not happy with it, and he kind of forced me to live with him. So it's where I live now, and that was probably the biggest upswing, getting healthier and moving out. And then probably a month after I felt completely better, I did a 100-mile bike ride. So kind of proved that I was back at 100%.
Wow.
And then I finished up an accounting degree, got an accounting job, and that's where I am now. But going back through that time period, there was like times where, I felt as though death were preferable. I felt that many times. And because, a relationship was something that I've really wanted for a while, and having it just collapse beneath my feet was a real letdown. And I didn't lose hope on that. I knew there's plenty of fish in the sea, and the Lord provides. But then once my health started to deteriorate, then I thought, this is the end. And then I lamented because I at that time I didn't feel like I'd lived a good life. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. But out of it, I've learned how close death can come and how to live in a way that is more glorifying to God. I don't think I was in blatant sin, but I certainly wasn't. Before this, I wasn't intentionally serving God as well as I could. So that led me towards a lot of reading and introspection. And through that, me and my friend Nick, we set up a table in the downtown city we live. It's very not Christian. And we just put a sign that said, "Ask us about Jesus." And we've had some good conversations with people. That came out of my suffering. And there was other people who were suffering. Once I tell them how I've gotten through all of this, that's very encouraging to them. So the Lord is working the whole time, but it was not fun. And it was, the best way to describe it was no hope. There's no way that I'm going to get out of this. But the Lord has showed himself to be loving and caring and compassionate to me, and brought me out of depths I did not think I could come out of.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing one and kind of walking us through that season. I know that that's not always easy, and especially when, there's so much packed into it, right? It was not just one thing. It was, the combination of 10 things that were all kind of coming to a head, one after another. And, I'll just say, wow, praise God for bringing you through that, because a lot of people don't survive going through one major thing, let alone, a lot of major things. And especially once your health is involved, I feel like that's one of the hardest things to come out of is, dealing with some sort of chronic illness or, something that the doctors can't figure out. It's like you would pay any amount of money for a lot of things, but your health is probably the number one thing, Yeah. But would love for you to just kind of elaborate a little bit more on just going through a season of, really no hope and feeling like death was on the doorstep. Like, how did this progress? Was it truly just through one of your friends? How long kind of did this switch take? And just kind of elaborate a little bit more on how God's used this season and, what he's taught you through this.
Yeah. So the biggest thing God's taught me is just to trust him. That is far and away the biggest lesson I've learned. One of the things that I was doing while I was in this is I tend to not want to feel sorry for myself. And so what I did is I instead started to look and see whose lives were worse than mine. And I looked at places like North Korea. Their lives are awful. There's parts of India where they're just cut off from society. Their lives are pretty terrible there. Parts of Southeast Asia. And these are people who never have heard of Christ, and they have no hope in their faith either. And if they're surviving day to day in worse circumstance than I am, then I don't really have the right to complain, which helped me get through it and helped me understand my faith a little more. But it also brought me to a point where I was praying a lot for those people, and my perspective on life changed quite a bit. Once I got a more worldwide perspective, it was a lot easier to love others in a way that I hadn't really before. And then when you suffer, you start to understand other people's suffering a little better, and so a lot easier to have compassionate feelings towards people through that. Yeah, and then the faith that I needed. That there was a point where I gave a little bit of money to a ministry, and for some reason, the CEO of this ministry called me, and he was telling me about this family in India who with the village they were in, you only got a job if you were Hindu or Muslim, and they had just converted to Christianity, and they were forced to quit their jobs, and they were so poor that they were collecting garbage to burn outside their home to heat it. And when he went and visited them, he was expecting them to be lamenting, but they went up to him and they were so insanely grateful for the gospel, and they were overjoyed that they had this hope in Christ to look forward to. And that's really what we have. We just need to focus on that, and we get so stuck in what's happening tomorrow, what's happening next week, that we can't see the ultimate ending. And you look in First, Second Peter, where Peter's telling them that your trials are going through now, they're for this greater glory that's coming. And you need to keep your eyes on that. And keeping your eyes on that it's surprisingly more difficult now that I'm not suffering. It was a lot easier when there wasn't anything else to look at. But as I'm adjusting, I'm finding that living now with that mindset, it just makes life so much easier. There's just this peace. Like, I know no matter what happens to me, I am guaranteed this eternal salvation and eternity with Christ. And yeah, and that's the biggest lesson that I gained.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you touched on, it was easier to think about that when you were struggling versus now. And it's kind of reminds me of scripture somewhere talks about, like the sick people don't need a doctor, or the healthy people don't need a doctor.
Right.
And so a lot of people that are healthy and are doing well and all the things, it can be so easy to revert back to, I'm doing good, I don't need God, I'm doing this all right, I'll call you when I need you, kind of thing, like we do to our doctors. And so I think that it's important to remember that we need him all the time, and and not just remember to call on him in those super sick moments.
Yeah.
When you were sharing your story, you also touched on, you kind of moved to Texas to pursue this career in comedy and kind of a dream that you had. And I'd love for you to share just a little bit more about that season and walking away from that and kind of what transpired through just that section of this valley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the comedy, I really have just enjoyed being funny ever since high school. I made these little videos, and everyone in my school thought they were really funny. Some teachers would stop me in the hallway and compliment them. I thought it was great.
Class clown.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't really the class clown of my school. I was just that we had a lot of funny people, and I was just another guy. But I was really the only one who went outside of just making jokes in class and made something funny. So after high school, I went and I did stand up off and on for probably 4 years, and I was never really good, but I really liked it. But I knew I was funny. I knew that if I pushed myself and really worked on it, I could do well with that. So I moved to Washington, and a little bit of that move was I knew I could go down to Seattle to perform comedy. I never did, because right after I moved, the pandemic hit and everything around us closed. And then the move to Texas was I'm going all in on comedy. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do my best to be a comedian. When I got down there, stuff with my sister had happened, and I was just trying to push through and get to the other side of it. And I remember I would bomb probably half the time. That's pretty normal for comedians, and I do well half the time. And the times I would do well, I get home and I feel worse than the times I bombed. And I really couldn't figure out why. But I started to think more about whether I should even do comedy. And the crowd I was around really wasn't glorifying God at all. And I knew that if I was going to get funnier, I was going to have to compromise on my values on, what I was going to say, and kind of the style of comedy would have to get less clean. And I wasn't willing to compromise. And I remember sitting and I made a decision like within a moment where I was like, I'm either going to have to start writing stuff that's just not clean, but I know is really funny, or I'm just have to quit altogether. Cause that's kind of maybe it was just an event across, maybe it was another but those were the two that I decided were options. And I decided to quit and be done with it. For a little bit of context, my comedy style is really goofy, but I'm funniest when I'm mean, which is great for the areas in, but I didn't want to just make a career of tearing people down. So I just stopped pretty abruptly. And then I was there for a few months after trying to make a life in Texas. The Lord did not have that for me. But when I quit comedy, it was saying goodbye to all these dreams I had and all these desires for fame. And I think really a lot of it was rooted in just wanting to be loved by people. And it was pretty hurtful, or not hurtful. It was pretty painful to walk away from that dream. Yeah. But then I had to just stop looking back at it, and, I have no regrets walking away from it. My faith has grown a lot more from walking away than I ever would have had I continued on. And maybe one day the Lord has that for me in the future. But for now, I am content with where the Lord has brought me.
Yeah. I think that's a really important piece that you share about, in that, you didn't feel like you could do it and glorify God, and that you would have to compromise your faith, in order to do it. And, having the courage isn't the right word, but having the conviction maybe to walk away and following that and giving up your dream, I think just speaks volumes of your relationship with Christ. And I think that it's amazing that you were, kind of saw that. I think sometimes we can be blind and we can think, oh, this is just in this bucket over here. But, the Bible's very clear about everything we do, we need to do it and glorify God. And so, if you feel like you're doing something and you can't bring him into that, or, you feel like you're doing the opposite, then, maybe you do have to walk away, even though that is one of your lifelong, dreams or things. But I think it's really important that you also noted that you maybe understood that that was rooted in a little bit of an unhealthy thing of, wanting to be loved and needing that validation. And, you said you've grown in your faith, and I would assume that, you've kind of found that in God and through the church and things now. And so, I'm just so thankful that even though you sacrificed your dream for a good reason, obviously, but God was able to fulfill that desire in you in another way. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So kind of wrapping up your story, I know there's a lot of different pieces. There's the losing your sister, giving up your dream, walking through a breakup, health concerns, just all of these things that really just beat you down. If someone is in a similar season where they just feel like the waves are crashing all around them and they're drowning, just what advice would you give them? I know that this is kind of it's a hard question to answer, but, just if you have any advice or any words of encouragement, even for someone who's going through a similar season.
Yeah, really just you gotta thug it out. There's really not a better way to phrase it. I mean, it's day by day, it's so hard to see a light at the end of the tunnel. It's like you're in a train tunnel. It's really windy, and then you're terrified any lights coming at you or the train. So there's no good thing you can say to someone in that position. I've had plenty of people trying to encourage me and help me through it, but there's like this level of despair that really only God can help. And so that's the advice, is go to God. Tell him he cares. He knows your trials, and he loves you, and he has a plan for your suffering. One thing that I noticed was people will call people who are suffering or have gone through a lot of suffering, they'll call them strong, but there's not really a lot of thought behind it. Like when I had my medical stuff as an infant, growing up, people would say, wow, you're so strong for going through all of that. But I never really understood what that meant. And as I've grown, I found that strength there's a lot of strength you gain from suffering. And God will use suffering to build your character and build you closer to him and create someone who glorifies God in a better way. There's a guy, Nabil Qureshi. He was a former Muslim converted to Christianity. Ended up getting cancer in his 30s or 40s. I think it was late 30s. And he talks about this dream that he had where he talked with Jesus and Jesus tells him, you need to give your daughter a bath. Now, he didn't understand what this meant, but he wakes up and later that evening he goes and he starts to wash his daughter and he touches her with a sponge and she's just weeping. And he kind of understood this to mean that God was using his illness to clean him, but he did not want it. And I don't quite understand what that means completely, but I know there's truth in it, that this suffering is going to do good things. God has a use for your suffering. All things work together for the glory of God.
Yeah, I think that's so good. I thank you for sharing that. I think that's helpful. And, like you said, like I said, and then you confirmed, like, there's really no good advice. I know that a lot of advice whenever you're in that season just kind of, goes with the wind, but, just giving it to God and letting God work through it and, taking it to him. And then, God can provide in different ways. And, maybe God provided, not maybe, I think he did, but, through your friend who, constantly was checking in on you and just really being there for you, even without you asking for help. And so, yeah. Anyways, I just want to say thank you for sharing all of that. And thank you for sharing this insanely difficult season of your life. And I know that that's not always easy, but I appreciate it. And like you said, I think God can use people that have been through things to help others that are going through the same thing. And so that's why I'm so thankful that you're sharing and just wanted to say thank you so much.
Yeah.
And then for those listening who maybe want to keep up with you or connect with you in some way, where can they find you?
You can come to my house in Bellingham, Washington. No, you can follow me on Instagram at davidfarm04. I'm really not a big social media person, but that's the closest I'll get. So you follow me, I'll probably send you a couple memes.
Hey, he said he's a comedian, guys. Go send him some messages and let him send you some memes, and we'll see if he's really funny after all.
Yeah, we'll see.
Well, thank you again so much, David, for sharing and for just willing to come on this podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of My Valley, His Victory. If you or someone you know are interested in being on this podcast, please email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com.